Hi, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much, Anthony and Catherine, for organizing this and accepting to be part of this.
It's a great pleasure. Looking forward to the hour. So, Audrey, let me start by saying your book is really different. I think if most people were going to write a book about the young Leibniz, they would be looking just at the philosophy, arte combinatoria, confessio, summa rerum, looking for anticipations of the later metaphysics. And our image of Leibniz, I think, was someone who, well, we knew about the Hartz mining project and maybe a little about alchemy, but we didn't realize that actually what he's thinking about 99% of his time is how to get funding, how to advance his mechanical inventions and social improvement schemes, and gives us a totally different picture from the philosopher sitting in his study working out a system. Were you aware that you were writing a very non-standard intellectual biography?
Well, I didn't. Thanks for your very good question. Well, I didn't set out to write a different biography just for the sake of writing a different biography. This is just the way. This is just how it happened, how it unfolded, and yes, and sometimes different is good. And I think I was a bit frustrated. There is a lot of scholarship on Leibniz, especially on his philosophy and his physics, but there's also a whole world to him, and it was important, giving a sense of the context in which he evolved, and giving a sense of who he was. And actually, what I did in this particular task, as I see it as a task like any other task, is I looked at his letters, and sometimes I would see in the many letters, which I read many hundreds of letters, and I would see what would be underlined by people before me. And it was always the crunchy things, the juicy things about the monads and the principle of sufficient reason, or his combinatoria, and the rest would just be discarded or left aside. And I thought it might be interesting to tell that story. And it's always fun discovering people, behind the image of the towering genius and the arch rationalist. I find that very intriguing to know, who was the real Leibniz.
Yeah. So in the arc of the story, I think Leibniz comes from Germany into the much more sophisticated, better organized worlds of Paris and to some extent London with their scientific societies. And he wants to really make a good impression. And he wants to learn some mathematics and applied science. And he just soaks everything up. He teaches himself, he learns from other people, gets to know a bit about Hobbes and Huygens. But he has to return to Germany, which is a huge letdown. He makes the best of his situation. He develops this correspondence network and develops as a philosopher. Is that the trajectory? Is that basically the story you were trying to tell? And what did I leave out?
Well, it's a very non-linear trajectory. I mean, overall, you're right. And yes, he has to go back to Germany, and not anywhere in Germany. He has to go back to Hanover. And, even today, Hanover is not exactly, the heart of the action, is it? Uh, I once spent a few weeks there, but eventually had to flee quickly with Deutsche Bahn in direction of Berlin. Such was my despair and my isolation. Now just think of poor Leibniz, who would have been stuck there for 40 years. But it is overall a very non-linear trajectory, and that's also part of the idea, part of the story here. I mean, there have been I mean, all of Leibniz scholarship and scholarship on Leibniz rather is really remarkable and erudite and sophisticated, but there is a tendency perhaps in Leibniz scholarship to want to precisely portray his trajectory as very linear, as very unified, unified within the infinity and the different levels, and as if there's some kind of, a quasi-metaphysical, a trajectory underlying his path and his destiny. And actually what comes out is that his path was, anything but linear. It was full of obstacles, of setbacks, of various failures, of disappointments, of making the wrong remarks to people, of rubbing people the wrong way or making the wrong impressions of people, despite his claims to specialness. But that makes it all the more interesting, I guess. You know, who wants to read about people who have very, very linear, boring lives? You know, it's in the trials and tribulations precisely that we find human characteristics, and that we find characters endearing and interesting, perhaps.
No. So one of the top themes in the book is patronage and how that works. And you say on page 30, far from being pure, the pursuit of science and scholarship were heavily conditioned by the social structures in which they were conducted. People needed support from the hereditary elites who had the money. And Leibniz is trying to get a foothold in that world. And as you say, he's sometimes a bit gauche, rubbing people the wrong way, or just getting people a bit tired of his importunateness. But at the same time, they sense that there's something really quite extraordinary about him as a young man. He's done an enormous amount by the time he's 24. My picture of him in this Paris period is he really likes math and he likes physics a bit, but applied science tech is really his thing. That's what he wants to do, is invent useful things. Is that fair?
Thank you very much. You've raised different points very succinctly, and I'm honored that you read this book with such detail. I'm not sure I've reread it with such detail since I wrote it. But you know, and you've raised really 3 points, and maybe I'll deal with them successively, if you permit me. You mentioned the connection between patronage and science, and this is a huge issue at the time, and something that really needed to be addressed and developed. You know, and especially at this time where we have a shift from traditional patronage and with personal patrons, for example, the Medici family, should a shift to state patronage, notably, as embodied perhaps the best by Colbert's State Republic of Letters. And Leibniz will be very concerned about trying to secure a place in there. And what really comes out is that, you can only really practice science or have access to, a certain level of science if you manage to infiltrate and get into that apparatus, that state institution. And this is contingent on you first, showing that you can, with your science, be of use to the state. So, it's science on the condition of political benefit, with the hope, especially in Leibniz's case, that then once he's in, he will be able to implement and deploy and practice science as he wishes. The second thing you've mentioned was that he is quite ineffective in many respects, but people do still sense that maybe there is something extraordinary about him. And this is very interesting because the period is really marked by the idea of sifting and the idea of ambiguity. There is a lot, Leibniz himself says, there is a lot of manure, but sometimes there is a diamond within the manure. So there's a lot of ambiguity, epistemological ambiguity, where, you have to remain open-minded, but skeptical at the time. And, people would have perceived him that way. And this is also something he himself practiced from his own perspective. And finally, yes, in a way, the triumph of technology. This is a technological age. And, with the primacy of not technology for technology, but technology for what is going to be useful for the state, what is going to be beneficial, what is going to help fill the coffers of the state and rulers, especially after the 30 Years' War, a war that has been devastating, as you know, and you write very well, if I recall correctly. And, So rulers want, and this is why this class of people, of, technicians, quote unquote, even though this is an anachronistic term, and of experts, what will become known as experts in the 19th century, comes into play. And they are valuable to the extent that they can contribute and they can be used by the various rulers to that effect and in that particular role. And so, I talk about the rise of the class of projectors, for example, and how, you have many, many people like Leibniz. And this is what we forget, is that Leibniz was not unique. There are many, quote unquote, people who could have been Leibniz on some level, but who don't make it because everyone at the time is pitching a project. There are many inventors, there are many technicians, and they are all promising to various inventions, technical inventions especially, which promise to, bring about some kind of public good, and generally with, the promise also of some significant financial component. And then, whether these projects, these schemes work in our work is then a different matter. Yeah.
In fact, your book gave me a slightly better opinion of the hereditary aristocracy than I had before. I thought they were kind of just into hunting, shooting, and fishing, and warfare, and conspicuous consumption. But many of them seem to have genuine intellectual interests and really to want to further social projects as well as technological projects, and to have some bit of expertise themselves. So Leibniz seems to have had a good relationship with Johann Friedrich, especially in that respect, from your account.
Absolutely, and that's a crucial component. And Leibniz himself identifies, very early on, it all hinges, the advance of science and technology hinges on the patronage and the support of a ruler. And, you can, on your own, invent many, many things, but if you have the support of a ruler, it's like you invented things for hundreds of years, and that really is the crucial difference. And yes, he's lucky enough in the scheme of things to have the support, enjoy the support of Duke Johann Friedrich. So not all is lost when he is, quote unquote, stuck in slightly lower form of court in Hanover. Johann Friedrich is genuinely interested in science and technology and, studying and, erudition. But then again, this only goes so far. These people, rulers, can be interested in knowledge, in the advancements of knowledge, but, their priorities do remain the advancement of wealth and welfare and prosperity of the state. Yeah. And so, you have to juggle that. If you're someone like Leibniz or anyone else, as a matter of fact, you can pitch things in terms of, reasons of state, and this is how then, there's a question of how do you position yourself? If you come to Duke Johann Friedrich and say, yes, I just want to, and this is, sometimes what he does. For example, he has a scheme for a universal language, which is, very, very noble scheme, but, is this really going to help out Johann Friedrich in his governance and leadership of the state? This seems less likely. However, a scheme for, hearts minds, for example, which would help, basically with the production of silver. Now that's more interesting.
Right. Getting a bit into philosophy, one of the ambivalences that you mention is his relationship to Cartesianism. He really seems to have a love-hate relationship with mechanical philosophy, and especially the Cartesians. He thinks they're cultish, they're narrow, they're not very interesting, they're too mechanical, but at the same time, of course, he's a big proponent of a hyper-mechanical philosophy, at least later on. Can you tell us a bit about his relationship with the French Cartesians? I don't think there were too many German Cartesians around at that point.
Yes, it is mainly French. Well, I think we need to distinguish first, Descartes and the Cartesians, and Leibniz really takes issue more with the Cartesians, as in the followers of Descartes, rather than Descartes and Cartesianism per se. I mean, he agrees, broadly speaking, with Cartesianism. He just says it doesn't go far enough. Where he really takes issue is what he perceives as particularly dogmatic and in a way what we would call today bigoted view of Cartesians in their rejection of everything and all kinds of knowledge that have been accumulated from the past, in their kind of tabula rasa approach, which kind of reminds me, like Cartesians, if they were today, they would be like the people who, who would be canceling others. I mean, I think, and it's a kind of an interesting, way of thinking about things, I guess. So he, and that they're very aggressive and audacious, and that they're also quite misguided intellectually, because fundamentally Leibniz believes that, there is a bit of truth everywhere, and it's about sifting, it's about being open-minded, but always remaining skeptical. There's this kind of, dialectic. And, we shouldn't be fighting with each other. We shouldn't be, in our little dogmatic bubbles. We should precisely try to come together and help one another and contribute, individually, piece by piece, to the great edifice of human knowledge and human improvement, effectively. And in that sense, Leibniz is a great message for today.
Yeah. One of his interests that I didn't really have a grip on was he claims to be very interested in history and the biblical narratives, establishing their truth through examination of historical sources. What's all that about? What kind of truth is he trying to establish there?
Well, and this is, jumping from Cartesianism, in fact, and the Cartesians, which is something I should have specified. The Cartesians, he perceives in the Cartesians, a major threat, which is one to religion and faith. And so he believes, perhaps, slightly ironically, and in collaboration with this French thinker, French theologian called Huet, that we can prove rationally that certain biblical narratives did occur, and especially we should be particularly mindful to be collecting historical evidence and recording various things to be able to have all of that knowledge, to be able to prove the veracity of faith. But he does make various distinctions too between scientific proof and theological proof, but that's also a different debate. Yeah, but that was very important to him. But it was also a form of, sometimes people think that, there's this idea that Leibniz was a bit bigoted, or he's just this very religious person, but it's a form of, as Amos Funkenstein, I think, put it very well, it's a form of rational theology. It's a very enlightened form of theology, which is in conformity with reason, with rationality, but which, transcends it. And from which, well, we can be inspired or not.
Yeah. One side of Leibniz that's more familiar to us is this interest in math and physics and technology. And we sometimes think of highly intelligent people, and obviously Leibniz is highly intelligent, as sort of nerdy and self-centered. And what really comes through in your book is the altruism. And in fact, I did some reading about this. Very intelligent people are more altruistic than not very intelligent people. And they see these better ways of doing things. And they get very frustrated when other people won't go along with it, or don't see the point, or can't get their heads around it. So some of the things that you mentioned that I thought were very charming details were swap sites for exchanging things you don't need anymore, and life and hazard insurance plans. It seems to have come up with that. Beer manufacture, pandemic containment. It's a wonderful series of things he wanted to do to make people's lives better.
Yes, no, absolutely. And this is a really, really great point. And I thank you for raising it. Yeah, Leibniz, and this is something I really like. He's clever. It's not an abstract kind of, autistic intelligence. It's a clever, practical-minded, open, pragmatic form of intelligence, with the purpose of trying to better people's lives. And this is really a really great theme recurring. This is a bit the thread that runs throughout his life. The idea of how can I come up with solutions to make things better? He was the great philosopher, the arch rationalist thinker with the monads and the principle of sufficient reason. But, actually it came down to, there's a problem. How can I come up with a solution? And I really like this about Leibniz because, I'm kind of like Leibniz. I kind of think a bit in similar ways on that level. Being able to, find a solution and in a way that is a win-win situation for everyone, which is the best kind of solution. And he is a pioneer. He's a pioneer in insurance. He is a pioneer in mathematics. He's a pioneer in medical public medicine. And what I've added in the book is translations that have never been made of some of the societies Leibniz wanted to create, and some of them, economic societies. I mean, he delves in, economic work about ideal societies. How we would treat the poor, how we would educate the children, how where should we manufacture, import, export. I mean, these are very concrete, economic matters. And they're not just, but he was always like that. He was always, making up proposals and, which have found, which weren't without, which were with merit, and this is, and I think if he was a genius, if he had a spark of genius, it's very much in that respect.
Yeah. I remember the passage where he wants to send a design for a coach that will turn into a boat to Justel. And Justel writes a very tactful letter saying he's seen the design and he just has a few questions about how it's really going to work. And you mentioned that Leibniz kind of wanted to get credit for just coming up with inventions, even if it was somebody else's problem to actually make them.
But I mean, he mentions that, that wagon that could travel from Amsterdam to somewhere in Germany, and then Becher mocks him over it. But actually, it's not so far-fetched having a wagon, effectively a long train that would carry passengers. And if you think about, the delays that generally come with traveling with Deutsche Bahn and the cancellations, actually, it probably would have been faster with Leibniz than today, according to that plan.
Right. And we have amphibious
yes, I mean
the boats now. So
I mean, it's something really remarkable. And I remember I used to email various people in the world, at MIT or KCL, and tell them, you've been talking about those kinds of atoms that are actually alive, or this and that have perception. And I would write to these people, do you know that Leibniz thought about exactly that 300 years ago? And obviously there's always the temptation to want to make connections and so on. And, as we grow older, we become slightly more cautious, but there is very much of that with Leibniz. And the fact that his thought was so incredibly interdisciplinary, on every possible level, something that no longer really exists because we are also specialized in our studies. But, it's, perhaps also something that could inspire us in trying to be slightly more multifaceted also in our approach to the world.
You translated that drôle de pensée, where
Yes.
this is all the fantasies of his installation with games and horse races and magic lanterns and meteors and all this is going to be, I don't know, with the comedies playing. And I thought, this drôle de pensée, because I once wrote a paper called "Did the Philosophers Believe in Their Systems?" And it was inspired by Paul Vane wrote a book called "Did the Greeks Believe in Their Myths?" And he said, well, they did and they didn't. And I began to worry. This is the monadology of sort of drôle de pensée, where Leibniz just invents this incredible structure with all these moving parts that are supposed to somehow fit together and work. And what is it for? It is supposed to serve some kind of moral or theologically useful purpose. And I began to think, yeah, maybe somehow this inventiveness carried over in a somewhat different way from, say, the way Descartes or Malebranche would go about constructing a system.
That's great that you mentioned that. And that's something that really kept me going back to Leibniz, you know, the way he thinks. He has a particular turn of mind, which you don't find in many thinkers. And that really, for me, that really, you know, is what it's all about. Yes, for example, drôle de pensée. And you get an insight into this, you know, this world of wonder and of the world of marvelous observations. It's something we fail to appreciate. Actually, we read this and thinking, this is just fantasy. But actually, you know, Leibniz was very much at a historical juncture, you know, a time of considerable epistemological fluidity where, you know, the possible and the impossible, the distinction between the two wasn't set yet in a way. And so, you know, what seemed impossible could actually be possible, and conversely, what was foolish, what seemed foolish and silly, could very well be implemented. And actually, you know, with the Paris Olympic Games, the opening ceremony where they have a metal horse, you know, galloping down the Seine, this could be directly out of Leibniz, out of that text. Because what inspired Leibniz to write that text was when he saw a man, you know, in a mechanical structure walk, you know, and that was, you know, that was really, you know, you get a sense of the incredible moment, the incredible historical moment of discovering the world and wonder. And this is something that is very, very, you know, important to me and nearly, you know, frankly, personal. You mentioned, you know, yes, all of these people, you know, coming up with inventions, and I don't remember what exactly you wanted me to comment about.
Expecting to be rewarded for inventions that never materialize, just for having the idea.
Yes, well,
right? Like today's patent system, where you have to show that it's safe and effective and actually does something.
Well, I mean, this is a great point. And obviously, I mean, some people have written much better about me than this, but basically considering the, you know, uncertainty of the time is that you can have an idea, but, you know, reducing that idea to practice is a whole different matter. And so this is something that Leibniz sometimes, you know, fails to understand. You know, he has this idea of a machine, of a beautiful calculating machine, which can, you know, divide and multiply. And so he's building on what Pascal invented, but he just thinks it's going to be really, really easy to do. And, you know, obviously it doesn't really work and it fails, but he's basically trying to get money out of Colbert, or trying to get money out of the rulers, you know, on the basis of that idea. And so, you know, and this is when that kind of, you know, the idea of intellectual property eventually emerges.
Yeah. I think this should probably be my last question, because I imagine Anthony wants to get in. But you do say that it's impossible to understand Leibniz properly without knowing something about these early interests. What do you say to people who say, well, I'm a Leibniz scholar and all I want to do is figure out what Leibniz thinks about free will or predestination or something? Is your attitude more like, well, okay, that's your thing, you do it, other people do it too, and you can criticize each other? Or is it more like, no, you're actually really missing something if you do your scholarship that way?
Well, I have a Leibnizian answer to this, is that, yes, you know, you are right on a certain level, but you are probably missing some of the, you know, part of the picture, which is a shame for you, but, you know, That's it. And I think it is a shame, and it's been a shame perhaps in Leibniz scholarship. It's also, more broadly speaking, some of these texts, the traditional scholarship on Leibniz, which deals with some of his more arid topics, can be quite technical and quite dry. And it's fun reading his letters and watching him make a fool of himself and embarrass himself, writing to X or Y ruler, don't you know who I am? And, it's very unusual. It's very lively. It's good fun, really, as simple as that. And it's endearing. It makes him, human, alive, and endearing.
It's good.
Okay then, well, it looks like it's the time for the audience Q&A part of the event. So we have a few questions already. Please keep them coming in. Send them to the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. So let's open with a question from Alice, who says, thanks for this conversation. Leibniz may have been a technological pioneer, but is there anything in his thinking that can help us negotiate the complex contemporary questions related to technology? So I guess we'll put that to you first, Audrey, as someone who is interested in both Leibniz and technology.
Thank you. I'll try to. I feel like this is like the Miss Universe pageant, and I have to solve world peace in 30 seconds, but I'll give it a shot. Yes, I mean Leibniz has many insights in his attitude. First of all, the fact that he is really, against dogmaticism and very much, his thought is very much dynamic. With regards to technology, well, actually, I've just been finishing writing a small article on Leibniz and AI, and Leibniz actually is at the forefront of this because he envisages systems which are who are so automatic that they are become autonomous. And these are the famous monads, these kind of atoms which reflect all of the other atoms and reflect reality from their own particular point of view, unfolding in a determined yet spontaneous manner. So yes, please read my article when it comes out in a few months' time. But yes, you had absolutely great insights to tell us. In fact, Norbert Wiener, the father of cybernetics, calls him, refers to him as one of the pioneers of the field. And he has a particular form, he envisages a particular form of organism which is alive and has perception. So he was very much a visionary on that level too.
Thanks, Audrey. Is there anything, Catherine, that you want to add to Alice's original question or Audrey's response to it?
Well, I just thought of some problems with the digital age. I think on one hand, there's this tremendous openness in Leibniz that we've been talking about, and this multifaceted curiosity. On the other hand, at least when he got older, he was very interested in censorship. And maybe he went overboard with what he thought should be censored, but he saw the need for some kinds of moral control in the society. And this is becoming a big issue for us.
Any response to that, Audrey? Would Leibniz be cracking down in the technological domain these days?
Yes, I mean, it's all about a balance between, freedom, creativity, inventivity, but at the same time, regulation too. And for Leibniz envisages very early on, what we conceive as intellectual automation, that is these software programs which do our work for us, and he has something that would be considered very close, very similar to the Searle experiment, where he sees there is a mill and it is moving and it seems alive, but when you open it, it is empty. And so he tells us that, this proves there is no understanding. It's just an illusion. There is nothing, echoing statements made hundreds of years later by people like, Weizenbaum when he's talking about the program ELIZA. The thing for Leibniz is that all of these tools, these wonderful digital tools, these wonderful mechanical tools, they help us. They help us improve our lives. They help us free up time for then, you know, useful, creative, purposeful activities, but they must never replace us, because we are in the image of God, you know, and we are similar to God and the divine mind as, you know, a drop of water is to the ocean. And this is something that is, you know, that is, you know, very, very special. And he's already emphasizing that then. No.
Great. So our next question is from an anonymous attendee, and I think they are outlining a position that I can definitely relate to, as evidenced by my lack of knowledge of Leibniz, which I spoke about in the introduction. So they say Leibniz's philosophy seems intimidating, perhaps more than any philosopher. People tend to, quote, warn me off from reading him, even more, say, than Kant or Hegel. As a lay philosopher, is it worth actually reading him, or should I just stick with your book? If the former, where to begin?
That's a very, very fair point. And I've actually had professors show me exactly where in the monadology they've got the post-it, and this is where they stopped reading Leibniz. I don't really understand this. I have to be completely honest. I don't understand where Leibniz gets this reputation from. Leibniz, A, is not that complicated or obscure. He's actually in many respects systematic. One way of, you know, one way that is not too frightening, actually, of looking at Leibniz, approaching Leibniz, is starting by through his letters, you know, and I've often suggested that people read his correspondence with the Sophie Charlotte, you know, which contains a nice summary of his positions. You know, I should really, you know, be clear. Leibniz is not that frightening or complicated or obscure. He's not. He's actually a very luminous thinker. And he is not that complicated. Yes, if you look at his mathematics and, you know, the great discussions, that would be more complicated and frankly tedious. Or you can buy my book. Or you can, you know, have a look at various biographies and, you know, do it one step at a time. Yes, he's not that frightening.
Yeah. I would just add to that, that if you start with the monadology, as many of us do as undergraduates, you can be sort of captivated by all the imagery and the fish pond and the mirrors and everything. But for just basically understanding what the hell is going on, it's really useful to know that he's an opponent of physical atomism, atomistic atheism, but he wants to keep the scientific perspective and the mechanical philosophy. So he invents a new kind of atom, or he discovers a new kind of atom.
And actually,
the mental atom.
And actually, you know, he used a lot of metaphors, especially when he's writing in these letters, you know, to these princesses. So, you know, he's not going to write in a very complicated style. He's not writing to a peer or another philosopher. He's writing to to a princess or someone who is somewhat learned but is not a great philosopher or a physicist. And he's actually extremely pedagogical and clear and yes, and very, very lucid. And he loves to use metaphors, and that makes it all the clearer. Absolutely, actually.
Catherine, where did your relationship with Leibniz begin? Was it as a undergraduate, or did you stumble on him? Did you find him easy to get a grip on, or was he kind of a struggle in the early days?
Yeah, well, I was taking a reading course with Margaret Wilson, who was a Princeton philosopher. And first we did Descartes. And she didn't really think much of my treatment of Descartes. And then we did Leibniz, and she said, "Oh, I see this has really engaged you and really interested you, and you're doing much better on Leibniz than you were on Descartes." Now I think I do okay on Descartes as well. But I think I was kind of captivated by the imagery, by the monadology, and just it's like with Wittgenstein, when you first read the Tractatus, you think, what's going on here? It's something really profound that I don't quite understand. That it wasn't really until I got on this atomism kick that then I really started to see what I thought, what at least I thought was going on.
Is Leibniz a thinker that you still engage with, Catherine? I know that your latest book was on Kant. Did Leibniz feature at all in that, or do they inhabit completely different philosophical universes?
I wrote something on Leibniz on drive just recently, the concept of drive, and a few other somewhat slight pieces, but anyway, a little bit interesting. But no, heavy sustained bibliographical research, nope, probably out of that game.
So is Leibniz your favorite philosopher, Audrey, or is he just the one that you've written a book on?
Oh, that is a tough question. He's one of the a few who keeps me engaged, I will say, and he will always have a special place in my heart, and I will always have him in the part of my mind, you know, whether in the foreground or in the background. And yes, you know, people, you know, and his way of thinking and there's twists and turns of his thought have kept me very, very much engaged. And I'm sure they will, especially when his writings on language and history, you know, series 5 start coming out more. Because actually the fact is, you know, most of what Leibniz wrote was in his letters. All these works that we have were published posthumously. A lot of them were published posthumously. And so Leibniz wrote and wrote and wrote all the time. He was a compulsive letter writer. And so there are so many that that they haven't all been edited yet or really uncovered. So the Leibniz edition in Germany is going through that methodically. And we still have many more, you know, treasures to unpack and open when it comes to Leibniz. Yeah.
Super. Now, questions come through from Ella. It's always a risky question because you may not know anything about Aeon Whitehead in this case. But what are although there are clearly significant differences, says Ella, can you generally compare any similarities between Leibniz and Aeon Whitehead?
Was Ella the student? No, it's not. Okay, it's Ella. There are actually, it's process philosophy, and and that's one of the things about Leibniz. Even though he is not acknowledged as having influenced many thinkers, he had a huge influence on many thinkers, especially more dynamic kind of philosophies. You know, from Fichte to Schelling, you know, to even to Hegel, and then on to Whitehead, Bergson, and so on, going down the line. So yes, Leibniz is pretty much everywhere, and that's why knowing a bit about him gives you an extremely solid foundation to pursue philosophical research later on. And actually, funnily enough, something quite amusing is that a lot of people who study Leibniz then go on to study different fields. You know, John Dewey wrote his thesis on Leibniz. France's foremost expert on political Islam wrote his thesis on Leibniz. You know, and I've written my thesis on Leibniz, and I'm working on philosophy of AI now. So he's a great, you know, he's a great platform to work from, and gives you many, you know, is an incredibly stimulating thinker and, you know, open onto the world, very much so.
Brilliant. So we've got a comment rather than a question from Jonathan, who responds to the earlier question about the accessibility levels. My own introduction to philosophy as an undergraduate was a course on Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz by E.M. Curley. I found Descartes and Spinoza complicated and not always clear writers, but Leibniz's writing style is very clear, I thought, as I read him before I was supposed to in the course and ignored Descartes and Spinoza. I went up to a library and read through the Monadology and other things of his. I have loved his work ever since. So anyone out there who feels that Leibniz is this impenetrable waste of time for you as a non-academic philosopher, Jonathan, Audrey, and Catherine have all challenged that position. So Catherine, back to you. Do you have any final questions for Audrey before we wrap up the event? I know that you had a list as long as your arm. You may have got through most of them, but do you have any final ones that you wanted to put to her?
I was just a little curious about how Audrey got onto this topic. I know that she'd done a paper or two on Leibniz before, but then I thought of her as sort of into digital topics and AI and writing reviews and things. And then suddenly we have this very, very substantial thesis. And I just wondered what led her into it. And I think I'm getting a sense that she does feel, like many of us, a kind of affinity with Leibniz. So there's some sort of special relationship there.
Yes, I mean Leibniz is a quirky, clever thinker who is a bit of a misfit and is often naughty. So that's a good summary for me, really, possibly. But he's an incredibly quirky thinker. I had written my master's thesis on Leibniz. Leibniz's concept of continuity as art of paradox, and in which Leibniz explains to us that actually two perpendicular lines can be interpreted as parallel, and that finitude is actually a special case of infinity. I mean, who comes up with this stuff, So I thought, this is really excellent. I really need to probe this. And hopefully, it gives a sense of the originality of his thought. Obviously I had looked at Descartes and Spinoza, but Leibniz, he's like a juggler. It's when you open on Leibniz, you open a book, you open on a world of wonders in many respects, and it's a different way of apprehending the world. That is really rich and alive and vibrant and luminous. And that really very much appeals to me.